In May 2023, Republican politicians approved an amendment to the Ohio Constitution that would make it harder for the majority to amend the Constitution going forward. Politicians say the purpose is to prevent the extreme far left and special interests from changing the Ohio Constitution. Comments like this stoke fear and divisiveness in Ohio, but don't make sense. For more than 100 years, amendments to the Ohio Constitution can only be made if approved by the majority of voters. Since when is the majority of voters the far left, or a special interest group, or the far right for that matter? Another rationale provided is that the Ohio Constitution is too long or too detailed in some places. Is that a reason to take power away from the majority of voters to amend their own constitution? The real purpose of the proposed amendment is better understood in the context of other steps Republican politicians have taken. First, without gerrymandering and essentially fixed elections that ensured a Republican supermajority before the election ever happened, Republican politicians never would have had the 60% of House and Senate votes they needed to put this on the ballot. To get that supermajority in 2022, when only 54% of voters have historically voted for Republican candidates, top Republican politicians defied millions of Ohio voters, 71% of whom voted for fair districts in a landslide. And they repeatedly and intentionally defied the Ohio Supreme Court and the Ohio Constitution. They did this to ensure one-party rule and for the political power that comes with a veto-proof supermajority. You can see the full details on Ohio's 2022 redistricting process at protectohiosvote.com. Because of a new voting law passed by Republican politicians, for the first time in 2022, voting ballots for Ohio Supreme Court and Court of Appeals judges had Democrat or Republican next to each candidate's name. So now, judges tied to the Republican Party, when both elected and re-elected, are more likely to be pressured to support the Republican Party line instead of being fair and impartial. We've already seen elected politicians call for the impeachment of an Ohio Supreme Court Chief Justice just because of her decision on redistricting. As a result, the new judge election law will politicize the courts, and the check and balance between the courts and legislature will be weaker, giving even more power to a gerrymandered legislature to do what it wants. In 2023, Republican politicians passed a new voting law that requires a government-issued ID to vote. With 1 million suspended driver's licenses in Ohio, this voting law will reduce the number of voters, targeting primarily the poor, the elderly, and those who do not drive, and primarily Democrat voters. Republican politicians said the purpose of the new law was to combat voter fraud, but no evidence of voter fraud was provided except about 700 cases referred to prosecutors out of 10 million votes. That's equal to 0.007% of 10 million votes. The real purpose was to help ensure one-party rule and once again increase Republican politicians' political power. Now the amendment approved by the gerrymandered Republican legislature both one, makes it harder to get an amendment on the ballot by doubling the number of counties where signatures must be collected, and two, makes it harder to get an amendment passed by taking power away from the majority and increasing to 60% the vote needed. This gives more power to the legislature because it makes it harder for Ohio voters to make change when they disagree with politicians, like for fair districts. Under this measure, the minority can actually rule. That is, if 59% of Ohio was in favor and 41% against a particular matter, the minority would actually win. In addition, the Ohio Ballot Board, with the majority made up of Republican politicians, has approved that the summary information voters see in the voting booth will not say that the voters are being asked to approve an increase from the current 50% majority to a 60% vote needed. So the proposed amendment was approved by a supermajority legislature, which is based on unconstitutional district maps that then uses clever language to hide from voters the actual change voters are being asked to make. 4 former Ohio governors have come out against the proposed amendment, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Looked at together, you can see a pattern. Each of these steps is designed to increase politicians' power and take power away from Ohio voters. And that's the real reason for Republican politicians approving the constitutional amendment. Based on what they've done, we should be talking about how to make amending the Ohio Constitution easier, not harder. Ohio voters will have the final say on the proposed amendment when they vote in an August special election scheduled by Republicans at an additional taxpayer cost of $20 million. If you want to keep power with the majority, be sure to vote August 8 or beginning July 11 for early and absentee voting.